Christian, your new book called Look, How to Pay Attention in a Distracted World reminds us that the most difficult thing to see is what is really there. So in what ways do you believe we misunderstand and underestimate how we perceive the world, including other humans?
I think a lot of things come between us and the world. So there are a lot of distractions in front of us. And the worst one, the one that distracts us the most, is our own opinions. So many of us have strong opinions about the world. It could be political opinions, it could be social opinions, it could be aesthetic opinions about taste. And we filter what we see through that. So when you read the newspaper in the morning, you would see the things that you get upset by, or the things that you have strong opinions by. That would stand out to you, and you won't really get to see what is actually happening in the world because you filter it through opinion. And I saw the students I've taught over the years, they are being taught to have strong opinions, and strong opinions weakly held, in a sense, and they can't see the world because they have that filter. So getting rid of that filter that distracts you, which is your own opinions, and just look instead of thinking, instead of coming up with reasons why something is good or bad, is a good start to see what's really there.
Yeah, and in that, you're somewhat also alluding to having like a direct observation. You mentioned filters. And so if you remove filters, you're now isolating and trying to have a direct observation. I'm curious if that's almost nearly impossible these days, considering how fast-paced life is. I mean, earlier before hitting record, we were talking about how the to-do list seems to never end. So I'm curious how, in a fast-paced life, how do you think people can start to isolate that sort of direct observation so that they can prioritize slowing down and maybe prioritize observing better? And that could probably lead to making better decisions, having healthier relationships, whatever the case may be.
Right. Well, podcasts like this one might be an example that people actually have long attention span. It used to be that, a radio show, you would have 2 minutes or 7 minutes if you were lucky. Now people listen to podcasts that are an hour long or sometimes 3 hours long. Yeah. And that's an example, I think, of our ability to actually still pay attention. But the kind of attention I'm describing in the book is that I taught philosophy for a while, and I was interested in writing a philosophical book. So I was interested fundamentally in the experience that humans have, when we perceive the world and pay attention to the world. And what's interesting, I think, when we start looking at and observing how humans interact with the world, you see that we don't experience the world as a technology would, like a camera or a sensor or a microphone or an AI even. We don't experience the world like that, as individual atomistic data points. We see the world as full of meaning and social, in a sense. So just walking down the street, I live on 13th Street in Manhattan. So when I just walk down the street, I know what's there, so I don't have to pay attention to it. So I know what cars are, I know what bicycles are, I know what a school is, I know what Amazon delivery trucks are, I know what they do. So I don't need to know the color, I don't need to know many things to actually operate in that situation. So humans, in order to perceive the world, need very, very little information, like very, very little data. And when we see a school, for instance, we don't see the color of the bricks of the school, we don't count how many students are there. We don't count the data. We just see school because we know what schools are and we know how they operate, and we can react to that because we understand it in that way. So humans are kind of special creatures in terms of how we pay attention, how we perceive the world. And that's what I wanted to sort of celebrate in the book, that we are pretty amazing creatures, and the things we do are things that machines, for instance, can't do.
That's true. Interesting. I love that because it's so true. I mean, you could just be walking down around in your neighborhood. You're not really looking at every detail, but you know what's going on there. And just kind of thinking about so far the context of what we talked about, it's like if you think about what you pay attention to, that becomes your reality, that becomes your life. And so if you're constantly paying attention to the challenges, the negative parts, the things that are always in your way, it's going to always feel like that's your entire life. But I think if you start to observe the path or, you know, you kind of have to just observe the path and just figure out that that is going to be your life. And so my point is that if whatever you're observing becomes your reality. And so you have to think about what you're observing. Um, So anyway, I was just thinking, I mean, that's kind of
Yeah.
just popped in my head.
Right. I
But
mean, what you're describing is maybe, or what you're looking for is different types of attention. So if you imagine you walk down the street and you just walk down the street, you know what things are. You don't even have a thought in your head. You just move through the street without any processing in the sense of intellectual processing. You're not thinking about anything. You might be thinking about something completely different. And you don't have language to describe what you're seeing. You're not trying to process language in your head in order to experience what's going on. You're just there. It's what great sports people do as well. They're not thinking when they're doing those amazing things. They're just doing it because they know how those things work. And they just happen to do it at a really high level. So that's sort of the baseline type of attention. In the book, I call that panoptic attention. It's where you pay attention to everything and nothing at the same time. Then there's the type of attention that many people want and talk about, which is focus. So that's a different kind of attention. So focus is that you can hone in on, or you can sort of like a beam of light focus on one thing. So if you imagine you walk down the street, you can see the exact color of a car, or you can really pay attention to somebody's hair, or you can really pay attention to where the students are going of the school we talked about before. You can do that, and that kind of attention is celebrated as something amazing, and it's fine, but it's not as amazing as the first one. In many ways, we can do it. It's what scientists do, and we have that ability. But then the kind of attention that I'm trying to describe in the book, and that I think we really need, I call hyper reflection. And hyper reflection is paying attention to how other people are paying attention. So it's observing how other people observe. So if you imagine you walk down the street on 13th Street and you see the people moving around, you can start observing how do they find their way around in this. What is the sort of scaffolding of practices that are happening when they walk down the street, and you can suddenly start seeing how this whole thing works out. So, for instance, down the street from where I live, there's the Union Square, which is kind of a city square in the middle. And sometimes when I feel very distracted, I go down there and I observe the chess players. So there are people lining up to play chess. And I just try to write down what I see. And what I'm trying to see is, what is winning? What does it mean to win? And you see a lot of drama happening around the phenomenon of winning. And instead of judging it and saying it's good or bad or something like that, I'm just trying to describe how these people relate to winning. And that's that's a hyper reflection type of thinking. It's not observing the action, it's observing the structure of the action, the human structure of the action. And that kind of attention can help us. It can help us get closer to the place we live. It can make good decisions based on how something works for humans. So I wanted to celebrate hyper reflection in the book, which is this sort of third type of attention.
It's really interesting because it's like looking at the foreground and background all at once as opposed to one or the other. But I'm curious, actually, maybe getting a little personal here, but like, what inspired you to get into this? What inspired you to start studying this perception? And was there like a personal experience that happened in your life that shaped your interest?
Right. I mean, I think my personality is kind of quiet. So I would rather observe others than being in the center of attention. I'd rather, I wouldn't want to be the CEO on stage. I'd rather figure out how to help him or her. So my personality is one of sort of careful study. And then the second thing, when I was quite young, I started a company, and I learned that it works. So I learned that when you do these things, you can figure out how something works. You can figure out how people relate to cars or mobile phones or healthcare or, cancer treatment or sports. You can learn how that works. And if you do, you can make great products, and you can or services, and you can help out. So I just learned it from seeing it working. And then one thing took the next, and here I am. So it wasn't, yeah, you just find yourself in it, I think. And because there wasn't very many obstacles for me, it was just sort of quite quickly I learned that this thing about observation is really helpful. And then what happened, when I sold my company, I was asked by the provost of the new school in Manhattan if I wanted to come and teach and as a work as an academic for a while. And his question was, that thing you do and the thing you do in your company clearly works. But can you teach it? Like, can you teach observation of that kind? Can you teach hyper-reflection? And that became a class I taught for 10 years. And that the book, Look, How to Pay Attention in a Distracted World, is a description of that class. So sort of one thing took the next, and here we are talking about that book.
Yeah, it's just compounded to this moment that we're here. And when you were talking about hyper reflection before, you're talking about really like our relationship to things and observing it in some way. And so you actually write about it in your book, about this concept of phenomenology, which is the science of phenomena, or the study of how things appear. And so I'm curious, in your practice and doing this for so long, I mean, how are you differentiating between what's important and what can be dismissed? So when you're observing, how do you know what's important? How do you know what can be dismissed? What's the foreground to you? What's the background to you? How do you think
Hmm.
about all of that?
Right. I'm trying to figure out how the background works. That's what I'm looking for. And I learned quite young. I learned that I am usually wrong in the beginning. I'm usually not very good at making quick decisions. And when I judge something, that could be anything, that could be who's going to win the next election, or what's good to do in a business situation or something like that, I'm usually wrong. So I learned to distrust my own judgment quite quickly because I'm just not very good at it. So instead of that, I take the time to gather information or to gather data about a topic. So I usually pick a phenomenon, a social phenomenon that could be money or winning or being seen, different kind of social things that we all know, and then study it enough that I feel comfortable with saying something about it. And what I'm always looking for is the relationship between foreground and background. So there's an event that happens that could be two cars crash into each other on the street I live. But then I'm interested in the background behavior around that. What happens then? How do people relate to each other? So that's an event that happens on a background. It could also be you launch a new car. In my work, I worked a lot with automotive companies, and you make a new car, but on background of what? Like, what kind of practices and behaviors will that car fit into? So if it's an SUV, it might be about at least wanting an outdoor life, and how does that work? So I just learned not to trust my judgment and instead wait a little bit and look before I I form any opinions. So it doesn't come from a place of strength. It comes from a place of weakness in a sense, right? It's sort of a just being not very good at immediately reading a situation.
That's really interesting. And obviously, the context of the situation is going to be different and will vary pretty greatly. But what I'm hearing from you is that maybe some of the best qualities or the top qualities of the best observers are that they are humble because they may not trust themselves in terms of what they're seeing, that they try to figure out what the background is looking like, and that they're trying to spend time gathering info. But do you find that there might be some more in terms of universal traits that can define a great observer other
I
than what
think
we just talked about?
yes. So I think careful relationship to data, like being really organized in capturing and organizing and analyzing data. So phenomenology or social sciences in general are sciences in the sense that there's data, there's hypotheses, there's testing of hypotheses, there's all those things. So an observer doesn't wing it in that sense.
Mm.
You're quite organized around it. So that's one. The other one is the ability to synthesize, right? So you see a lot of different things going on, but what's the overall pattern in the practice? And I wrote a book before this one that's called Sense Making, which is basically the practice of synthesis of data about humans. And that method is phenomenological. So in the phenomenological philosophical tradition, but there's something about the ability to see a lot of data that might go in all kinds of directions and say, these are the main 3 things that are going on, or the main 5 things that are going on. And these ones are more important than these ones. But only after you've done an organized effort to try to understand something.
That's really interesting because we've heard the word observation several times. At the beginning of the conversation, we talked about opinions for a brief moment. There are 2 different things. I'm learning that observation is probably something that's more developed, more slow. Opinion, kind of rush to an opinion. I'm just trying to think right now, okay, if someone is listening to this, like, how would you suggest to them that they strike that balance between having an observation and their own opinions? Like, correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't everyone's perspective sort of based on their biases and their beliefs? And so how do you get rid of that and only observe? Like,
Mm,
just separating the two.
right. Well, it's very hard, and maybe even impossible to distance yourself or look in a completely detached, abstract way, in
Yeah.
what Nagel calls the view from nowhere. And with natural sciences, in the natural sciences, you could study bacteria or planets or something like that, and the bacteria and the planets doesn't change their behavior just because you're looking. But with humans change their behavior when you're looking. And you also need to use your own humanity, your own humor, your own understanding of other people in order to interpret and see what's going on. So you cannot read you can't read Shakespeare and find it funny or dramatic or sad without understanding what funny and dramatic and sad is. So you
Right.
use yourself in the observation. The thing you can do, though, is you can try to understand someone else, someone with a different identity from a different place in the world, from a different time, the best you can. And, try to arrest your own opinions and your biases that we all have, of course, the best we can, because giving up on trying to understand each other is not a good idea. We have to, even though it's hard, we have to try. And I think if you're a company, or if you are just a human, giving up on trying to understand the people you're relating to, your friends or your customers or whoever you're dealing with, if you give up on trying to do that because of your biases, then I don't know, the whole thing will fall apart. So even though it's hard, we have to try.
Well, that's sort of one of the reasons why demonstrating empathy can be difficult for folks that are not practicing it, because it can be hard to really place yourself in someone else's shoes. But that is something that I think more people are trying to awaken to, and they're trying to incorporate that more in their life, because I think there is a more understanding that there is this kind of collective energy. We're all kind of related. We're all in this together to a certain degree. And even listening to your story about the times when you've gone to Union Square and simply sat there and observed the chess players and the people that are lining up to watch or play the next game, it goes back to one of the concepts that you allude to in the book, which is around the fact that we are part of the world, like we are enmeshed in the world. I think that's the exact word that you use. And so you even write, think about the fact that, quote, you are of the world and in the world, end quote. So, what does it mean to experience the world from inside a human body? I think these kind of questions tie into what you just talked about, and can really even maybe shift the perspective in terms of like, what is perception, what is reality, and this idea that we are enmeshed in the world.
Mhm. Yeah. So I mean, these are deep philosophical questions you're asking. So the one tradition, which comes from René Descartes, the French philosopher, many others, but he was sort of the prince of that, is the idea that we are subjects and we can stand in as opposed to objects, and we can study them. So you imagine you look at a chair, then you can, if you're a scientific person, you can measure it, you can see what is it made of, how the weight of it, the color of it, and so on. We can do that, and that's the second type of focus observation or attention that I talked about before. So this sort of subject-object distinction that looks at humans as detached entities, in a sense, from the world. And I think what happened in the phenomenological tradition, so these are philosophers like Martin Heidegger or Maurice Merleau-Ponty, that I try to describe in the book. They're saying, no, we're not subject-object distinction between us and the world. We can, but most of the time we're just in the middle of it. So so the classic example from Heidegger is hammering. So using a hammer, you can of course study a hammer and say it's a metal blob with a wooden stick attached to it, but most of the time we're just hammering. We're using it. So the hammer is not an object. It's part of us using it. And the same with cars or dinners or anything we're in the middle of. The stuff around us are not objects that we can sort of look at and measure and scientifically engage with it. Most of the time they're just tools we use to get through life. So we're in the midst of things, and that's a big distinction between, you could say, one philosophical tradition which is kind of empiricist and rationalist is what I describe in the book, and then you have a phenomenological description of how social it is. So if you go back to the chair we talked about before, if you come into a room and there are chairs and tables and plates and roasted lamb, then you could look at the chair and look at how much it weighs, or you can just see, okay, here's dinner. So where the chair is not in the foreground, dinner is in the foreground, and all the other things act as background to this social event that happens. And that's quite different from a cold look at the world. It's kind of a warm, human, experiential look at the world. And that's a philosophical tradition, conflict that has happened for the last, 100 years, 90 years now. It's been going on.
And maybe even more, which is why I feel like this is such an interesting topic. It's one of the main reasons I wanted to have this conversation with you and meet you, is because we're here talking about human perception. And that for thousands of years, philosophers have talked about it, artists, scientists, normal people. I mean, maybe some of us take the time to try to think about, like, how do we make meaning from what I'm looking at? Like, how, so how is this world coming together for us? How are we seeing each other? How am I seeing myself? How are we operating in this world? I think these are types of questions that have been around for thousands of years. It's probably going to be around for the next thousand of years, and I feel like that's why it's such an interesting topic. And what you're talking about and the way you just phrased that, it's like the perspective shift is that we have to understand that it's only us from inside the world, as opposed to thinking about the world and us as two different things.
Exactly. We're not looking at the world through a mirror or a window. We're in it. We are it. And of course, it's been going on. I mean, Aristotle talks about humans as thinking things, but when you're hammering, you're not thinking at all, right? You're just hammering. And if you start thinking about it, you won't be driving in nails. You'll hit your thumb or something. So it's most of the time we're not thinking at all. We're just being things, or we're doing things rather than thinking things. And of course,
Probably. Oh,
go on. Go on,
no, I
please.
didn't mean to cut you off, but that probably goes back to one of your earlier comments around athletes, right? You do enough hours of practice, you don't have to think about like, okay, don't fumble the ball, don't fumble the ball, don't fumble the ball. You kind of just run with the ball. And so it's like, even if you're trying to navigate an obstacle course, you're not a prime athlete is probably not thinking about like, don't fall. They're just looking at the path. They're just looking at the course.
Exactly. Yeah. And if you look at the best ones, if you look at a great basketball player, and you look them in the eyes, you really study what they're doing. They have this sort of panoptic kind of glaze of attention. They're looking at everything and nothing. They're not focused on anything. But then there's a moment where they suddenly snap into to a different kind of attention. So I know European football better than I know American football, and there are some players that can't express what they did. That they don't have language for it, but obviously they did it masterfully, 20 minutes ago. So when after the match is done and you ask Lionel Messi, how on earth did you do that? He wouldn't know, because it's not intellectual. It's not described in language. It's described in action. And that's a beautiful thing that we humans can do that.
Yeah. Speaking of Messi, selfishly, I'm really glad he's here in the States these days because it's making some of the highlights worth watching. I mean, he's incredible. We all kind of know that from his time in Europe, but having him here in the States and having him kind of more front of mind, it's really incredible to watch an athlete like him operate and do things that seem nearly impossible. And then to your point, he probably has a really tough time putting it into words. But I mean, just in terms of this conversation and speaking of perception, something that I was thinking about coming into it was how limited it is if you consider the fact that when you look at our human eye, we only see like 0.0035% of the electromagnetic spectrum. What we're seeing is the visible light, but we're nearly missing 100% of the entire electromagnetic spectrum. And here we are thinking that we see it all. And so I think I just wanted to fold that in because this whole conversation is about perception, attention, and observations. And so we're pretty limited. Maybe it's time to
It's
kind of.
even worse than that.
Oh, there you go.
It's even worse than what you're talking about. So when you see, if you stand on a train track and you see a train far away, it's a tiny dot. And then you wait a little bit and suddenly, snap, it becomes a big train. So it's no longer a dot, it's suddenly a train. And it's not that you've seen that dot become a little bit bigger and a little bit bigger and a little bit bigger. You don't see it as a ramp of even increments getting bigger and bigger as it comes closer. You see either dot or you see a train. So we don't see what's there in a sense. We don't see the actual you could say raw data that's happening. So human perception doesn't work as a camera in the same way. If you recorded it with a video camera, it would have been a dot that becomes a little bit bigger, and it doesn't work as either or, in the sense that a train, the way you experience a train. So we humans, we see wholes, not parts. We see a small dot, and we see a whole train, and we understand those two things. We don't see all the things in the middle. And that's the same, with if you take color, for instance. If you take a fire truck and a wood and a sweater that have exactly the same Pantone strip, exactly the same color, one feels very fire trucky and the other one feels very woolly, even though our retina sees exactly the same color. So experientially, they're two different things, even though they're the same thing. A chord, if you take a C major chord on a piano, if that fits into a jazz tune versus a classical piece, then that chord is experienced completely different, even though the sound waves that hit our eardrums hit our body is the same. So color, distance, shape, sound are always experienced in their context, and not as extracted out of that context. We can do that. Science can do that, and we can do it sometimes, but it's not normal for us to do. So it's even worse. We're not seeing the raw data. We're seeing human worlds, and it's not bad. It's amazing that it's like that, but it's different from when we talk about perception as data collection and empirical in that sense. It's quite different.
Yeah, very different, and something that's going to take a lot of practice, because I'm thinking that do you think that it's just because of how we're designed? Is this just because of how our brain evolved? Do you think that this has anything to do with our brain just thinking about the outcome, or like predicting the outcome, trying to save us energies, trying to save us time, trying to save us our resources? Like, I guess my question is, do you think that this is just a brain design? Like, the brain wants to be efficient, but maybe we're challenging that a little bit right here in this conversation.
Well, it. I don't know about. I'm not a biologist, and I'm not a
Same.
neurologist, so I wouldn't claim I knew anything about that. But I would say we need very little information to operate in our world. So, if you take the big language models that are now sort of everybody's talking about, they need enormous amount of information to do very little. So if you take driving a car, a driverless car needs millions of hours of data of driving in an area in order to even find their way around, where a human can learn how to drive in 12 lessons and a test. It's amazing how little humans need to be able to do things that takes millions and millions of hours for machines. And the same with language models. They need enormous, energy sucking, data center size information to do things that we humans do just by walking down the street. So in that sense, it's high. Humans are highly efficient and way, way, way more efficient than artificial intelligence or something like that.
Earlier you said that you're more on the quiet side of things, but I can hear it in your voice. It sounds like you truly do believe that spending time watching, observing, really taking it in, maybe is actually adding a sort of energy to your life.
Definitely. I find walking on the street magical. Like if I have that attitude towards observing and I see how on earth does this work? Let's take traffic again. You live in California, right?
Yeah, I'm in the
Yeah.
San Diego area.
Right. So imagine the San Diego area. Every morning, several million people gets into their little car, and then they find their way through this Byzantine system of highways and little streets. And then they find their way somewhere else, millions of them at the same time. And, you could just drive that road and sort of, sure, you do that every day, but you can also look at it and say, how did we build this? How did we do this? And so for me, driving the normal route to and from somewhere can either be just a dull thing like everybody else, but it can also be just the human drama of the simple everyday life. In that sense, the everyday becomes magical if you sometimes have this attitude. And for me, it's also helpful in the sense that I can make things based on it that people will like, because I understand what their world looks like. So for me, it's a source of joy to observe. It's fun to see how human societies and human sort of emotions and human worlds hang together. Um, so yes, you're right. It gives me a lot of joy and energy and thrill to look at things that other people would just pass by.
Yeah, and I was reading your book and I was thinking about that because I'm like, look, and just based on your answer, it obviously sounds like you're actively involved. This is making you actually a more active participant. But I was thinking maybe there's going to be a sliver of people that look at this and they say, what if what if they practice watching? What if they practice listening to the point that they may actually get more detached from reality? Is there a risk that a person could now become a passive spectator in life? Like, is there a risk to practice watching and listening?
Yeah, of course. I mean, anything you do too much of is probably a bad idea. But it's something. It's a tool,
Yeah,
and
tool.
it's good to. For me, it's like going to the gym. It's helpful to go to the gym because your body doesn't feel bad, and you get a lot out of that. And the same with attention. You also need to go to a kind of attention gym, and preferably every day, where you spend some time just recording, just observing and describing rather than judging or having opinions about or just pass by. And if you do that, it's a tool set you can use in your work life or in your private life, in with your friends, in all kinds of ways. Just like so many other things we do. And I think it will connect you to other people, to the place you live, in a quite a healthy way if you practice this ongoing. So what I've seen in my students is they've felt that they lived an abstract life if everything is filtered through opinion. But when they start observing things directly, they feel closer to things, and they feel a direct connection to the social world around them. So I think there's a health aspect to it as well. I think it's just good for you to do these things. If you then overdo it, of course, you'll end up recording the world, and that's all you do. And that's probably not advisable.
Yeah. I guess on the overdoing thing part of it, maybe there's an element of like, and maybe I've done this in the past too, where especially in a social context, like you start to look for things that may not be there. So you're spending some of your energy and attention on like the unseen side of things, and that could lead to reading too much into something that may not even be there. So to your point, like everything in moderation, if you go too extreme, then there's obviously some negatives, but having this mental exercise of practicing watching and observing could add some energy to your life. It could obviously help you understand the difference between the world and us, help you feel more enmeshed, help you feel more as a part of a collective, which then helps with having more empathy, then helps with trying to live more gracefully. Um, yeah, so I think again, it's just a balancing act with everything, right?
Right. I think looking at what is not there can be quite helpful. So, I
Mm.
mean, you say what isn't there, but if you take in the book, I tell a story about Gillian Tett, the journalist from Financial Times, and she was walking around, spending time in 2007, around that time, and looking at bankers' conferences, and she saw people talking about graphs and talking about um, you know, abstract financial concepts. But what she didn't see were the humans underneath. So of course, the people that took out the mortgages that these bankers would talk about in very abstract ways were actual humans that would have to pay those mortgages eventually. And by so she was focusing on, why are they not talking about that? Like why are these masters of the universe, financial types, not talking about the underlying social infrastructure that will feed this system? So she's saying she wants to listen to the silences. She wants to She wants to look at the things that nobody talks about, the things that are not in the newspaper, the things that are not, you could say, on the dance floor, but outside the dance floor. At least that's the example she uses. So a good journalist or a good observer are also interested in the things that are not there and why they're not there. And she calls that listening to silence, which is kind of I don't know, a quirky or poetic way of saying it.
Yeah.
So a good observer is also saying, what could be here? Like what could happen here and why is it not? And there could be really good reasons for why it's not, but sometimes there's not good reasons. And that ended up with a financial crisis in 2008. And she was one of the few people that predicted it because she exactly looked for what wasn't said
Interesting.
in those moments.
Interesting. So
She's a master observer. Like Gillian Tett is a true master. And her book, she has a book called Anthrovision, which is a book about how anthropologists, she's an anthropologist, how anthropologists see the world. And we have a lot in common in the sense that I'm not an anthropologist, but she's saying I'm a philosopher doing anthropology. And I think she's an anthropologist. I don't know. But
doing
she,
philosophy.
yeah, exactly. She's an amazing observer fundamentally. And she's quite often looking for all the things that are not there.
Yeah, that's a strength. I think that's something to work towards, to become a more masterful observer. But we live in this world where everything is like based on group thinking, based on like certain ways of doing things, based on so many cliche statements. There's so many cliches that we hear every single day. I mean, but that also gives us like some sort of cohesiveness in society. So how do we get beyond that? Like, how do we strive to go beyond those cliches that we hear every day, the conventional thinking, the group thinking, which keeps us together? I think we're like, is there a risk that we lose some of that common ground?
I mean, we share a language, and if we don't share a language, and if we don't share rules for that language, we can't understand each other. So we need common systems. The same with the traffic system. We need to make sure that people stop at the red light.
Mm-hmm.
So that we got to have
Think
some
about that
cliche.
all the time. I think about that all the time. I'm like, look at this. We have a society or this system set up where people really follow this rule. What happens if like it's amazing to me that people follow that rule like 99% of the time.
Or money. Like, who decided that these pieces of paper had any value? But we have to, because if we don't trust each other, we don't have any transaction system between us. So we need that. But back to the cliches, it drives me nuts. It's sort of the thing that frustrates me the most, and particularly in the technology world, it's quite frustrating. So right now, people are talking about large language models and chatbots as if it's going to change everything. But those are the same people that 6 months earlier talked about cryptocurrencies. And those are the people that 6 months before that talked about the metaverse. And those are the people that before the metaverse that would change everything talked about blockchain. And before that, they talked about something else. So there is this sort of cliche trend kind of process. And everybody then gets completely immersed in the next thing, even though they know that the metaverse, maybe wasn't what they hoped it was. And cryptocurrency ended up being maybe a longer term process than just the short term burst that it was.
Yeah,
So
even with Chat GPT, right? The short-term burst where literally it seemed like overnight it took over the whole world. Millions of people signed up. But then if you look at over time, some of that interest in using Chat GPT for everything has come down.
at that time, it was 6 months ago, it was okay to say that this was more important than fire and electricity. The Google CEO said that. And people said, sure. Yeah, and I don't know how well that statement aged, but I understand where he comes from. He says that, of course, that if these technologies truly work and the kind of vision they have for it will truly work, then it will transform society in many ways. But fire, really? I hope when he goes home at night and cooks carrots, that he's got some level of either fire or electricity, and that's important as well. So there is, in the technology world in particular, in the financial sector as well, there is this, in the business world in general, there's this inability to observe and to look at these technologies and put them in context. So which background do they belong in? And then everybody goes and lose their mind. And then once they've lost their mind over something, then they lose their mind over a new thing, and on and on and on. And it drives me nuts that it happens.
Why
But
do you think there
observation
are
can
so
get
many
you out of it.
Yeah, observation can get you out of it. I didn't mean to cut you off, but I was wondering, why do you think there's so many distractions?
I mean, I talked to a friend of mine who jumps on many of these. He's an investor, and he jumps on many of these things and these trends, and invests in them and loses a lot of money all the time. And I asked him, so why do you do it? And he said, I just want to participate. I want to be part of things. I want to, I want to talk about the things everybody else talks about, and I want to invest in the things that everybody else invests in. And sometimes it goes good and well, and sometimes it doesn't. But I think there's a need to participate in whatever is hot at the moment, and quite an inability to see what's the background that this of human activity and human world that this fits into. For instance, like the cryptocurrency craze, very few people seem to ask the question, maybe we also have macroeconomics and control of the money supply, and that states with nuclear submarines and armies are controlling that. So I wonder if we can really take over the entire financial sector with these two new technologies, because we're up against macroeconomics. So it's, in many ways, it's a long conversation, but it was just, the world lost its mind for a while without thinking, what is money? I mean, how about we observe how people relate to money and how our financial system works, rather than going completely nuts over a technology that everybody then ended up kind of at least friends I have lost a lot of money on that, which is too bad for them and for the rest of us.
It's really interesting comment, though, that there's some sort of urge or desire for many people to need to want to be a part of the latest thing. I feel like if you think about like ancient wisdom and some of the Stoics, it's like they would just tell you that humans can be happy with very little and don't need to go chasing that next thing. So I feel like we've lost a little bit of the ancient wisdom, but if we kind of bring it back in the fold, it can help with some of the new age challenges that we face.
Right. Yeah, probably.
But we
For
can also
me,
get wisdom from animals. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
yeah, for me, observation is the source to stay sane. Like, instead of jumping in with both legs and say, I want to be optimistic about this, I want to be part of the future, but let me have a look first before I judge. And let
like
me
a trial run.
Exactly. Let's just think about it for a second and observe in a greater context of human sort of society whether this makes sense, or in which way it makes sense. And then we don't lose our minds over things that lets us down 6 months later. And then in the last 15 years, there's been just one wave after another of data analytics and big data, and just one way after another of things that turned out to be maybe not as much as we thought they were. And you have McKinsey and all the other sort of big consultancies. Every time they say it's a $4 trillion industry that's going to happen. Metaverse was a $4 trillion industry, and now, language models are $4 trillion industry. I don't know why it's always that number, but it just sounds large, I suppose. But it's bananas that it works that way. And I think observation is a calm, collected, careful, and also quite tender way of looking at things, without optimism or pessimism or any of that. Just let's observe before we start concluding anything.
Yeah, it's like I'm thinking right now, observation is more gazing, attention is like laser focus. just in terms
Right.
of trying to differentiate the shifts in perspective and the little nuance between those words, because they can be used interchangeably. Attention, observation, um, even opinion can get folded into kind of being all the same thing.
Right. They're very different. Yeah.
They're very different. Well, I mean, that's one of the biggest lessons I've learned just through this conversation and through reading the book is how different they are. And I was trying to connect the dots just in preparation for this conversation, because it was about perception and observation and paying attention, especially in a distracted world. And there's a book out by Oliver Berkman, somewhat related. I'm putting it out there for anyone who wants to do more research on it, but he wrote a book called 4,000 Weeks, which, by the way, is like the average lifespan of a human being. So in that book, he actually writes something that I want to read word for word and kind of tie it to this conversation, but also use it for anyone who wants to use it as a launching point for further research. But he says, our attention is our life. Most other resources on which we rely as individuals, such as food, money, and electricity, are things that facilitate life. And in some cases, it's possible to live without them, at least for a while. Attention, on the other hand, just is life. Your experience of being alive consists of nothing other than the sum of everything to which you pay attention. At the end of your life, looking back, whatever compelled your attention from moment to moment is simply what your life will have been. So when you pay attention to something you don't especially value, it's not an exaggeration to say that you're paying with your life.
Right. That's nice. That's a nice way of saying it, that you have to guard your attention, I suppose.
Yeah, and that your entire life is made up of things that you're giving attention to. Attention is life. Um, but I
Right.
wanted to actually ask you about something because you wrote about it in your book. You talk about how everything you need to know begins with birds. Can you
Right.
expand on that?
Yeah. Yeah. One of the main reasons why I wanted to write the book is that there is this book from the 1950s called The Peregrine, and it is my favorite book in the whole world. And I just somehow wanted to find a way to write about it because it's just so gorgeous, and it is the best observation I've ever seen. It's the best observation in itself, and it's the best description of what, in this case, J.A. Baker, who's the writer, sees. And he observes peregrine falcons and their entire world for 10 years. And every day, he's out with his binoculars to observe these birds and what they kill, how they eat, how they mate, how everything happens around them. And he describes the place he lives in through the observation of birds. And for me, I mean, I don't care so much about birds that I would sort of dedicate my life to it like he does. But the way he does it is amazing. So if you ever want to read what observation can be, like the best level, it's the Lionel Messi of observation. Then have a look at that book. And the way he describes it is that he says your eyes become insatiable for hawks. So he becomes kind of obsessed about this phenomenon in front of him, and it's what he sees, and that sort of level of obsession that he sees might be beyond what most people would experience. But it is a a way for him to describe what he sees in a way that's way better than science could do. It's a much better description of what he sees than what science does. And the second thing that is interesting, I write sort of a series of learnings from that book about observation, but another one is to observe like a hawk in a way. So if you see a peregrine falcon or a hawk, then if you look at it, it sort of spends its days washing its feathers and looking around and figuring out what the landscape is like and how the ducks move and so on. And then within a flash of a few seconds, it kills the duck it needs to eat that day. So it has this sort of careful observation of what it sees, which makes it possible for it to kill brutally in a very short amount of time. And I think with the same goes for work in my case, that you can sit and do busy work all day and tick off things from your list and feel productive.
Right.
But that's not what the bird does. It doesn't run around after every bird it sees. It waits. It sees the landscape. It figures out how the background works, and then the actual activity is quite short. And I saw, when I was a journalist a long, long time ago, I saw journalists working like hawks. So there are the people that were writing and rewriting and calling people and, just sweating through the day, trying to get an article out. And then there are the people that were just walking around, talking to people, trying to get a lay of the land of what on earth was happening. And then 20 minutes before deadline, they just banged out an article that was way better than the people that had worked all day on their articles, because they work like a hawk in that sense. They wait, and then they use that observation for something. And that's how I want to work, and that's how I see observation. That it gives you the direction and the clarity to do what you need to do, rather than trying to make yourself feel productive. You're not very productive when you do those things and just feel you have to answer every email. Figuring out what's important, figuring out the lay of the land, and then strike. So that's what he describes in that book is the practice of observation, how it works, and also use the natural world as examples for it. So I would, before anybody reads my book, please read that one twice. I read it every time I feel blue. I read it around the end of the year, just because it makes me happy. So it's an amazing description.
Yeah, and embedded in some of the lessons that you shared from that book, you or the author talks about how the mornings for the birds are more meditative. They're taking some trial runs. They're doing some like practice exercises, and then, as you say, they're basically preparing for that one hunt, where in that one moment, in one fell swoop, they go ahead and they make their kill. And so it's just something to think about as a human in terms of how we should operate in our day, in terms of like being more methodical, more meditative, maybe practice, and then go in, as opposed to some of the normal ways that we kind of operate in this really fast-paced, energetic world. And then this whole concept of perceiving the world from the eyes of an animal. I know you mentioned the hawk, but yeah, it's one of those things that we've actually talked about in previous episodes. We did an entire episode on consciousness and intelligence from the animal experience, the animal kingdom, right? Where we talked about actually, what is animal intelligence? What is it like to be an octopus, for example? What is it like to be a pig? What is it like to be an elephant? Tying it back to the hawk, does the bird know that its wing is flapping? I mean, like, what is it like to be in another body, whether that's an animal or a person? And that experience, or thinking about living that experience in that type of world, to me, is one way that can connect us and provide some amazing insights.
Yeah. One of the most successful people I've ever met in my life ran a very large bank. And I asked him, so how do you work? And he said, I maybe work half an hour a day. I go get coffee and I talk to people and I, read the news and I look at data and so on. But the actual work, the actual strike of that day is half an hour. I said, I don't have more in me of true productivity. So he works like a hawk in that sense. He cleans his feathers. He goes around, talks to people, goes through the motions. But then he has this sort of clear, moment where he then, which makes him, one of the most successful people on the planet. And it was interesting. He said, I could never tell anyone that's the case. He just did that to me, which is also why I can't mention his name. But he said, I couldn't tell people because we have to look busy for 15 hours a day if you work in a bank. But he said,
Right.
I can't do it. I'm not effective when I do that. So, so I'm not saying people should go out and study hawks. I'm interested in humans, but the attitude that J. Baker has to observing, in his case, the animal kingdom is something we can learn from when we observe, the financial system or something like that. And I just think it's such a delightful, beautiful read that I really hope the listeners here would go out and, learn it by heart.
Yeah. Yeah, it's an interesting way of also kind of getting rid of the layers. I'm right now thinking about the 40-year-olds, the 50-year-olds, the 60-year-olds in my life, right? If they hear this conversation, like they should be able to walk away with a few ideas in terms of how do you scrape away conventional thinking? How do you scrape away the cliches? How do you scrape away the layers and the lenses that have kind of filtered everybody and their ability to directly observe the world? So yeah, I'm thinking about the fact that this conversation can be applied, especially, for the older folks. I mean, as they live in the second half of their life and maybe come to grips with what their inner authority is and how they want to operate in the world and maybe make up for lost time, changing how you look, changing what you're paying attention to, changing what you're observing are all ways that can maybe lead to like a more fulfilling next 30, 40, 50, 60 years.
Yeah. People always talk about beginner's mind,
Yeah.
and they think about children are more open to the world and have less judgment. But I've actually found that older people know that they're probably wrong. Like they have much less arrogance and they're sort of epistemological humility in a sense. So I've actually found that people above a certain age are quite good observers because they've learned that the sort of the brash arrogance of their youth was silly. So I suppose it's very young and older are the kind of the demographics that are most prone, or most, have the best ability to do these things. You can of course keep it through life, but I'm not sure it's only the privilege of the kids. I think actually later in life you have the same sort of clarity that just comes from having been wrong a lot,
Yeah.
and knowing that you don't know everything. So
Yeah. And with the study and the more ideas around neuroplasticity, I think there's more people that are understanding that even as you get into your 50s, 60s, and 70s, you can actually change the patterns and the algorithms in your mind and your brain to make these types of adjustments to, again, have a more fulfilling life as we all head towards one destiny, I guess.
yeah.
But no, Christian, I appreciate your time. I know you're a very busy person. You have events, you're on podcasts, you're doing work, you're obviously, helping other people. So I really appreciate you spending some time with me. Um, and I guess, I mean, is there one last kind of impression you want to leave?
No, I think this was good. It was a wide-ranging, free-roaming conversation. It's delightful to have that once in a while. So thank you, and well prepared. Thank you very much.